Hello, welcome back, everyone. So Spencer Orlowski and Mac Hayes here to talk through some more arguments on the potential September-October topic. The European Union should establish a nuclear sharing agreement with France to create an independent deterrent capability. So last time we talked through some foundational international relations stuff, and we shared everyone on a textbook linked to the description that we really like, right? And more or less what we did last time was talk through what the scholars that kind of represent the first three chapters, the first three traditions of international relations, how they would approach the topic. So, how would a realist versus a liberalist kind of deal with this understanding of both international organizations, nuclear weapons, how do states relate to each other, all that kind of stuff. And so what we're going to talk about today is we're going to go and look at the next 10 chapters of that book, right, roughly, and look at all of the other different kind of lenses by which you could approach the topic. So Mac, before I, talk endlessly for an hour, any thoughts that you have on critiques before we get started?
Yeah, so critiques are really interesting. Obviously, they're starting to come into being more popular in public forum debate. We saw them emerge from other styles like policy and LD. For those of you who are not as familiar with what critiques are, we consider them more like progressive kinds of debate because they're relatively newer. And they usually deal with criticizing something other than the particular outcomes of like the resolution itself. So the assumptions, for example, or the logic that is rooted in the resolution, or even rooted in the arguments the other team is making. Do you want to do you have like a basic TLDR summary of what a critique
Yeah,
means?
absolutely, absolutely, right. I don't want to get too kind of bogged down in the debate jargon that everybody uses, right? I think that first and foremost, you should just think of this as looking at different literature to approach the topic, right? I think a lot of people do kind of characterize K's as almost like this tricky thing or this way of like winning rounds or bullying novices, right? And I think it's far more useful for everybody involved as a human, right? To just think of critical literature as a wave of literature from the mid 1800s going forward that's seeking to identify power structures in the world, right? Seeking to answer the question why, some people find themselves oppressed in the world and why others, aren't, right? And so every school of critical literature is trying to answer that question, right? And they're not necessarily mutual exclusive answers to that question, right? A lot of scholars are very what we would call intersectional, right? So they're looking at how power operates from through various different lenses and based on various different intersections, right? But the basic idea is, scholars looked around the world and they we're trying to answer the question why? Why do some people have and some people don't, right? So a lot of these answers will be very intuitive for you now, fortunately, because we're 200 years into this kind of like thought experiment, right? But for a lot of people at a lot of periods of time, these were very, very revolutionary ideas, right? Mary Wollstonecraft writing that women aren't necessarily supposed to be in the home, right? Did a lot to like kind of shake people's understandings of what is possible in the world, right? And so I think for a lot of debaters, they kind of forget that for many people, this is a novel kind of lens by which to learn about the world and about the topic, right? And so I really just like encourage students to approach critical literature with an open mindset of just trying to understand the world, right? And thinking about the kind of debate implications a little bit more secondary to that. Now, that's kind of the academic side, right? Just like looking at power, exploring that, looking at different people's perspectives on various different topics, right? From a debate perspective, Ks can take a lot of different forms, right? You alluded to this earlier, right? They might be criticizing somebody's representations in the round, the word choice you use, the imagery that you're marshaling. It might be the types of arguments you're defending, specific arguments you're defending, right? There's lots of different ways that we can generate links, both of things our opponent did, and based on just our side of the topic generally, right? In terms of structure with Ks, some of them will have alternatives. Alternatives are just sort of different problem-solving approaches to the world. These will typically not be policy solutions, but sometimes they can be, right? And other times they won't have alternatives at all. It might just be an independent voter argument that says you did something problematic, and so you should lose the debate for that reason. That's more popularly called K framework these days, right? But no matter what the format is, our goal is realistically the same. We're trying to identify a practice either in debate or in the world, explaining why that practice is wrong, why that practice makes the world worse, right? And then usually proposing a solution, but not always, right? So that's kind of the basics of it. We will do different videos going through the actual structure of a K, right? And also the structure of how to answer a K, right? But what we really want to talk about today is just how each of these different schools of thought would approach this topic. Really view this as like a kind of springboard lecture, right? Use this as a sort of starting point for you more deeply exploring one of these literature bases, right? I'm not going to go super in depth into any of them. Lord knows I could talk about Baudrillard and nuclear weapons for 2 hours. We're not going to do that, right? We're just going to go maybe spend 5-10 minutes on each one to give you a kind of kernel of something to take into your own scholarship. I will say I find researching K debate to be the absolute easiest thing. Once you kind of have the language down and you can read through this stuff quickly and meaningfully, right? I find searching for things for K debates very easy because the language of the articles is very, very predictable. And then the authors are also very, very predictable. So a lot of times, finding evidence for it might be as simple as literally putting in the author's last name, and then I will immediately have like a core of literature exactly for the critique I'm looking for, right? So you can use what we're talking about today fully to explore any of these ideas, right? But we'll use today to kind of pique your interest on a couple different ideas. Do you have any other thoughts before we move into any particulars?
I think you hit the nail on the head. A lot of people think about critiques in debate as completely separate from critical literature and critical theory in the real world, which is nonsense, right? Like they're called critical arguments for a reason. It's because they stem from something that is rooted in the real world, in real world scholarship, just like everything in debate. And I think it's important to recognize that like these are actual perspectives that motivate how people think about the world and how people interact with it, that are quite widespread in academia and in literature. They don't have to be like so radical either, as you alluded to, like this kind of critical literature. It's just sort of an umbrella for lots of different literature that seeks to answer this basic question about how power operates, why some people have and why some people don't, which has been around for a very, very long time. And some of the critical literature that originally appeared very radical is now so normalized in our everyday lives that no longer appears like critical in the same way, even though definitionally it still is. And so I think one thing that has unfortunately happened in lots of debate, included in PF, is this polarization between people who view themselves as more traditional debaters and people who view themselves as more critical debaters. When in reality, I think that there should be much more overlap because these things, they're both just ways of viewing the world at the end of the day, and they can be employed in many different ways to achieve many different goals within debate that don't have to be the same cookie cutter approach that you always see.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, I think it is very easy to just view this as some elitist thing that private schools are using to bully people, and easy to forget. No, this is just a reading list, right? And so very much view today as a reading list, and I promise nothing scary here, just good arguments, good perspectives on the world. All right, so let's get started then. We'll start with, one of the more popular Ks on the circuit. This is the anti-blackness K. So we're not really going to differentiate for this discussion the particular brands of anti-blackness that critiques that you might read in debate. There's large differences and similarities between a lot of the authors that we're about to talk about that could be 4 years of a PhD program looking at the distinctions between all of these different scholars, right? So I'm not trying to say that these are universal takes from a lot of these people. But in any event, anti-blackness is trying to look at how civil society, right, the world that we live in, that we at least in the West seem to think of as civilization, right, is fundamentally built on anti-blackness, right? That the human as such is defined as not black, right? And that is how civil society structures itself, right? Now, tangibly, that might look like us not treating black people as humans, whether that's in labor practices, larger economic practices, right? Policing, relationships, politics, right? You could look at any different lens in society to sort of diagnose this problem, right? But the basic idea is just that whiteness exists almost in opposition to blackness. So whiteness isn't able to define itself as anything other than not black, right? Now, how pessimistic that is will depend on which scholar we're talking about, right? Some scholars, like Wilderson, are going to take a little bit more of a pessimistic stance, thinking that that is not something that can be resolved in civil society, right? Whereas there's some more optimistic scholars who would say that you can, build enclaves within civil society to kind of like reduce the daily material manifestations of anti-blackness, right? A lot of scholars that you'll see associated with anti-blackness literature, Frank Wilderson is going to be the most popular one you'll see. You'll also see Jared Sexton, Calvin Warren, Sadia Hartman's another one I really like. Tiffany King is really great author, right? And in the context of a nuclear topic, right? I guess what I'll say is with nuclear weapons, every single critical scholar is going to talk about it at some point, right? If you're trying to write a theory of power in the world, you probably better be able to explain nuclear proliferation, right? This is one of the great problems of our time, right? This is one of the true big power moves, right? And we have nuclear war impacts in most debates for a reason, right? This is an actual scary thing that could end humanity, like fundamentally, right? And so we're going to see more Ks on this topic than we typically would, right? But an anti-blackness K would usually, in this context, be exploring how nuclear weapons either serve to maintain racial structures globally, right? It might be something about how nuclear weapons generally rely on these kinds of zones of disposability, whether that's in terms of testing on non-white populations, whether that's in terms of the mining and the waste that ends up in non-white neighborhoods, right? It might come from larger global prohibitions against brown people having nuclear weapons, right? You'll tend to notice that the U.S. is not okay when a country with dark skin is pursuing nuclear weapons, right? So any of these kind of different approaches you might find under the kind of umbrella of anti-blackness. I will say it is very unlikely that you're going to have an affirmative case on this, through this type of literature, right? There's the EU is a generally very colonial organization, right? It founded, or it's sort of like predecessor was the European Economic Community, right? Which was very much just like a bunch of colonizers in Europe coming together, right? So the EU is, a little more liberal than the US, but I remember around the first Trump election, one of my good friends at the time, everyone was talking about moving out of America and going to Northern Europe, and he was black and he was talking about it, and he was just like, I can't go there. What are you talking about, right? Like, yeah, Europe might seem all progressive to you all, but black people are not treated well there, and I think it's just kind of like a reminder that yeah, Europe does seem a little liberal, but these are the OG colonizers, right? Europe really did kind of build the slave trade and dominate South America, and you know, it, they're just not like they are the colonizers, right? Ultimately, and so a lot of the kind of literature surrounding anti-blackness and colonial is going to reflect that, right? That the European Union is not this kind of like civilizing force for good, like the West would have you believe, right? So any questions on anti-blackness?
Yeah, one question is how some of these arguments would manifest themselves within the debate. Like, what would an anti-blackness case actually look like on
Yeah.
the topic? Like, let's say, let's pretend the affirmative goes first in this hypothetical, which is not always the case in PF, and they read an argument about deterrence. How would the neg, for example, critique that kind of argument?
I guarantee you there is evidence that says deterrence operates under a racialized logic where we're, threatening non-white people all around the globe to make ourselves feel a little bit better at night. I know that evidence exists because we have that evidence cut already, right? Like I said, you might also have evidence about nuclear waste from nuclear testing, that kind of stuff, and just about how non-white communities kind of suffer as a result of the increasing of proliferation, right? And obviously, none of those are going to be particularly um, specific to a nuclear sharing agreement. I doubt you're going to have much very specific on that. I mean, I'm not saying you wouldn't find a link. I haven't looked. There probably might be something, but you're likely going to have a little bit more generic links focused on the impacts, right? Um, we'll usually have a warming link. We'll usually have just a fear of extinction link. There will inevitably be an EU as the actor link. You might also have France as the actor link. And so these cards are usually, I will admit, usually the link cards aren't making like kind of structural claims about humanism, right? And that they're not so much talking about how we are constructing non-white people as non-human. Typically, they're just like cards that say something is racist or has racist histories or racist outcomes, right? So that's where your link arguments are going to be generated from. There'll be some stuff based on the actor and then the idea of nuclear weapons, but like I said, I doubt there'll be much on the specific context of sharing. In terms of if you're reading an alternative or not, that completely depends on which author and how pessimistic you want to go, right? So, for example, you could read an Afrofuturism alternative with some kind of, sci-fi or some kind of, you know, uh, like sort of almost like a pop culture-y kind of alternative. You could have a pure pessimism alternative that's just like burn down civil society. You could go the Calvin Warren kind of middle ground where your alternative is more of like a metaphysical rejection of whiteness, right? You really could kind of take the alternative however you want, right? Most of what we've seen in the past few years has been the very K framework version, where you'll just read 4 or 5 links and then just be like, being racist is a voter, right? So then you don't have to rely on winning that alternative to kind of generate solvency. And I could see that being a lot of how it's deployed on this topic also. For example, a lot of people will just read the link arguments essentially as contentions with like a kind of structural violence framework. If you're going to do that, definitely pay attention to the next video that we do on fill frameworks and learn how to read that non-consequentialist. But yeah, that'll generally be the approach, right? Yeah, I don't think there'll be much specifically on sharing though.
Yeah, that makes sense. I know we're going to have another video about fill frameworks, but I wanted to ask in the context of anti-blackness here, what is
Yeah.
like the philosophy that undergirds it? Specifically, like, are these largely consequentialist arguments, like the consequences of this policy is likely to be bad because it is
Yeah.
rooted in anti-black logic, or is it just that the logic itself is bad?
So I actually think that's a really great question, and I think something that isn't answered a lot in debate. So most of these critiques that we're going to be talking through are what are called imminent critiques. Imminent critiques. This basically means that they don't have a robust description of normativity. And by that we mean the scholars aren't really seeking to say explicitly what is good or bad in the world, at least not as like a kind of like guidebook for action, if that makes sense, right? That is like a very particular brand of philosophy called normative ethics that most critical literature isn't particularly invested in, right? For example, I love how care ethicists approach this, right? They're like, look, I don't need your rigorous explanation to explain why I care for my child, right? Why I love my child and feel an obligation towards them, right? Kant spends hundreds of pages rigorously examining this. The logical positivists try to create all these formulas to prove normativity, right? And a lot of critical scholars are just like, look, we all know, right? We all get what oppression is and why it's bad. Let's figure out how it works and move from there, right? So, to answer your question, there is not that much of a discussion of normativity. And in terms of like consequences in the real world, there are very few actual philosophers in the world who think we should just completely, uh, you know, discount consequences when evaluating if something is good or bad. I think we make it seem really, really black and white in Phil debates in, high school debate, where we're like, no, 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 you can't look at consequences at all. I would say most scholars fall in the middle, and that's the case with a lot of these scholars. I think all of these scholars are going to be very critical of utilitarianism, right? They're going to be very critical of, the idea of sacrificing some to save others, right? But I do think, yes, a lot of them do care that the outcome of a policy is either increasing or decreasing, anti-blackness in the world, right? Um, yeah, they're definitely
Yeah,
not like
definitely.
fully deontic. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah,
So
yeah. So
that's
that
a
means
really
that,
interesting question though, because that is a very common, that is the debates that we have in LD, to be honest.
yeah, yeah, it makes sense. And this shows you how all of these different styles of debate that we're talking about, they all intersect with each other too. It's not like they're completely, you can't just put them into different buckets necessarily, even if that's how they're usually treated in debate these days.
Yeah,
And it
it's
means that,
it's
like,
wild to me. They really are. Like the dividing Phil and K debate. This is something Scopo and I talk about all the time. I don't get it. I like to me these are just like they're not like it's not like a linear conversation. This is like
yeah.
philosophy is such a messy web of ideas that I can't imagine just like arbitrarily deciding that like this one philosophy just like doesn't count. Like I don't, for example, understand how existentialism is not like critical literature to me. I get that it's also Phil literature, but I mean, you're sitting here being like, humans aren't born with any, explicit, um, purpose imbued in them, and then they come into the world to find meaning. That seems like so emancipatory to me. I don't know. I guess, yeah, I have lots of thoughts on all this.
Yeah, 100%. This also should change the way that you treat these in rounds. Like when you go into debating a K, given that most of these authors are, they at least are somewhat consequentialist, like a valid strategy against the K is to say, no, like the policy that we have will do things that reduce the amount of anti-blackness. Obviously, the scholars will say that maybe that's impossible if they're very pessimistic. Um, but I mean, this opens the door for like uh, the consequentialist types of debate that people feel more comfortable with already being brought into these kinds of discussions through a critical lens as well. Or it opens the door to like a discussion about whether or not consequences should be, it should matter in our debate or to what extent or how, which is a philosophy discussion that will bring in some topics we talk about next time as well.
Yeah. No, and I absolutely agree with what you're saying too. I think that viewing these as like scary, distinct arguments is a huge problem. I think that if you just use the fundamental skills you have, answering these arguments is not hard. And when we get down to the bottom, talking about, how to answer it, the thing that I always recommend is listen to what they said and respond, right? Like you don't need a fancy guide on how to do it. You don't need silly acronyms. All you need is they said you did something. Prove why you didn't. GG. Like answer the link. I don't know. Yeah, I agree with you. Just make smart consequentialist link turns and you will be fine on most of these arguments. All right, we ready to
Yeah,
move on to the next one?
let's do it.
All right, I'll try to move a little bit quicker since there'll be, some less background stuff. So the next big one that you'll see on a lot of these topics is a feminist international relations critique, FemIR. It is typically shortened. There's lots of different approaches to this. We'll see, same with the last one again, in terms of like how pessimistic, optimistic, that kind of thing. How intersectional is another big kind of difference you'll see in the various groupings of feminist literature on particular IR topics. But the basic idea behind FemIR is this is a broad grouping of criticisms that are just looking at how traditional IR always prioritizes masculine ideals, things like strength, rationality, and it takes for granted a lot of the realist assumptions that states are unitary actors, that they exist in a an anarchic cycle, right? That cooperation is impossible, that care shouldn't be a goal, right? All these kinds of things. There's a little bit more of a discussion of vulnerability, both as like something that motivates us, but also something that, we just need to be a little bit more comfortable with, right? Which, you can already kind of see how that would relate to a discussion of deterrence, which is all about eliminating vulnerability at all costs, right? It's all about very easily predicting the kind of emotional responses of others, like the signaling, their cues, their perception, all that kind of stuff, right? Feminist IR critiques will just generally make arguments about how traditional realism just assumes too much about the individual, and a lot of those assumptions are just founded in original patriarchal approaches to international relations, right? When you have six white dudes who study IR for 60 years and then they're cited by six more white dudes, and on and on for a couple hundred years, you end up with very similar ideas, right? And so that is the basic, broad approach to feminist IR. That might include specific examinations of how, gendered experiences are erased when it comes to discussing nuclear weapons, whether that means, we're missing the individuals involved in the production of it. That could talk about leaders and how gender discourse surrounding particular leaders' ability to have access to nuclear weapons. I remember when Hillary Clinton was running for president, there was like genuine, like, I'm not saying concern from good people, but I heard a lot of concern from people in Kentucky where I was living that like she was gonna like on her period nuke a random country, right? And so there's lots of different various literature surrounding nuclear weapons, nuclear command and control, that you might find related to feminist IR, right? I think that this will again generally be a negative argument, although care ethics might be able to justify a cosmopolitanism framework in a Phil sense on the AF. That might be something like uh, uh, that's something we want to talk about on the Phil one, to be honest, if we're gonna go into that. Some scholars that you'll see associated with FemIR, Cynthia Enola, is one that we used to read a lot. I generally look up bell hooks whenever I'm looking at these types of things. Very intersectional. Um, Ends up talking a lot about trans rights also. Great kind of discussion for FemIR. Some other people that we've seen associated with it over the years, Carol Cohn, or Khan, I don't remember how to say her name. That could be a good one, right? Uh, we tend to debate FemIR on most military topics. This tends to be one of the more common Ks that you'll see. Again, you'll see various different versions of it. Sometimes you'll see feminist killjoy, which is not an IR theory, but people will mix up the cards a lot. So you'll see like maybe a link card from a feminist IR author with an alternative that's feminist killjoy. Feminist killjoy is very explicitly about calling out sort of violence or problems when you see it, instead of like keeping peace, for example, at like a family dinner when your uncle's saying something racist, right? Fem killjoy is about identifying these problematic things that happen in the world and proactively combating against them, right? So it makes a really good alternative for debate because you can just like read a bunch of different links from a bunch of different sort of related scholars and then just essentially have that call out alternative at the bottom. You'll also see feminist killjoy a lot as just a completely non-topical AF for that same reason, right? Because you get to just like identify things that somebody did and then just have like a generic, almost like reject alternative, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I want to echo that. I think it's even more common to see feminism in K form in some way, read as a non-topical
Yeah.
argument instead of a topical one these days. The way that you can think about this is like we said earlier that critical theories are lenses that are discussing questions about how power operates in the world, but debate is also in the world. So this also can be about debate as a space in which power permeates. And so you can apply the same kinds of theories, although debate is not an international relations space. Like obviously there are different assumptions. A lot of authors will still write about like competitive activities and things, which will bring us more into criticizing like actions or problems within debate rather than within the topic itself.
Yeah, you'll find a lot of really good cards about conferences, especially like academic conferences, like meetings on denuclearization and how like women are sidelined in those discussions. Very, very much so. Like you will find very good method evidence. And you'll find like a lot of archaic cards will come from discussions of like academic conferences, experimental classes at universities, things like that, right? So even if they're
Yeah.
not talking about debate, honestly, sometimes they'll even use the word debate. They're referring to debates in a class or at a conference, right? But yeah, you'll find lots of evidence there. And Sarah Ahmed is the author for Femme Killjoy, by the way. I don't know if we said
Yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah. Um, and one I wanted to add is Jan Tickner. When I was taking a class at Brown, there was like it was like an intro PhD international relations class. She was one of the authors that we read for Feminist IR specifically. She's great. She has a lot of debates with a lot of the other authors of like, for example, structural liberalism, and institutionalism, which are great debates that can show you the differences and intersections between these different ways of like thinking about international relations and how they are methodologically different from each other as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. Um, so another kind of non-topical, sort of pseudo-topical version, I think, of this sort of literature that came up a lot on our nukes topic in, I want to say like 2019, 2020, was like this idea of the nuclear family. Um, I could see some people kind of exploring that. I have not thought of it beyond that. When we did it, it was banned nuclear weapons, so it was very easy to write in half that was like, abolish the nuclear family. Let's kind of like gender queer family and that sort of thing. I think that's probably a little more difficult on this like extraordinarily specific topic. But it's worth exploring. If me just offhandedly mentioning that results in somebody exploring that idea and writing something on it, I'll feel like I've done some good in the world. All right, anything
Yeah,
else on this one?
I feel like this is like it brings out some of the interesting treatment of topics as like
Mhm.
metaphorical treatment of topics, like using the language of a resolution, not just as a literal guide to the discussion, but as like a jumping off point or as an inspiration for a discussion about other things. There's lots of different
Yeah.
ways to treat the topic in debate. And I want to be clear that like these things are all different ways that they're all like formulated under the umbrella of K, even though honestly, to me, I think this umbrella is a little bit distorting because these are all very different ways of treating arguments. Like the non-topical advocacies that we were talking about, the metaphorical treatments of the topic, the independent voters that say like you did something, so you should lose, and the more consequentialist or the ones that are about how the topic will actually result in things in the real world. Like all four of these are very different buckets of arguments that, to be honest, I think deserve their own names. But for some reason, we call them all like Ks. But this creates a lot of confusion when people are first exploring Ks. It definitely created confusion for me. So it's worth it to try to understand which type of argument this is before you just call it a K.
Yeah. And I think the important thing to note there is we could use the same literature to support all four, right?
Yeah.
We really can. And that's why I love debate. I mean, I love that kids have that freedom to, however you want, right? I mean, this girl's been messaging me about psychoanalysis on this topic, and she keeps asking me, am I allowed to do this? I just keep being like, whatever you want to do. I don't know, right? It doesn't make sense. We'll see. We'll do a practice round, see if it's easy to answer, if it's hard, how many layers did it create for your opponent? Did it open you up to anything you didn't want to answer, right? Like there's not really a right answer, and that's why I think this is all so cool. All right,
Yeah.
so Femi, are we good?
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's do it.
Okay, so the next sort of grouping of arguments you'll see is disability studies. Um, Again, not going to be the most specific links in terms of nuclear sharing, but you'll see some kind of relationship with nuclear deterrence. There is like some literature about disabled individuals being disposal or being disposable as strategic sacrifices. Probably not the best links. There's definitely other topics that will have better links, but either way, disability in some of its versions will operate very similar to what we were talking about with anti-blackness, where it'll have some optimistic versions, some pessimistic versions. The more pessimistic versions will say that, the world is structured for, people who are not disabled, and, disability renders people non-human, and that people kind of define themselves in opposition to disability, right? The more pessimistic versions will very much mirror what we're talking about with anti-blackness in terms of like a total refusal of civil society. Mallow is the author that people read and debate for that a lot. Um, but most scholarship surrounding disability, and I would say this is true for a lot of the identity politics that we'll talk about in debate. In debate, you tend to see an overrepresentation of very pessimistic literature, because it lends itself really well to like kind of the black and white nature of being af versus neg, right? And I think that a lot of this literature in the real world is so much more nuanced than that. Most of these authors agree on like 90% of things, and then in debate we've positioned them as polar opposite, right? But yeah, in general, your link arguments for disability are going to try to identify why something they have done has rendered some bodies as either permanently vulnerable, or why it has created some sort of hierarchy of ability, right? Some other authors, other than Mallow, you'll see related to this. Puar writes a lot about disability, also writes a lot about queerness, and a lot about anti-Semitism,
How
a
do you
lot
just
about
spell that?
Islamophobia. Oh yeah, Puar, Jasper, Jasbir, space
Jasper Hooper. Yeah, okay.
uh, Bir, Jasbir.
Okay. B
No, no, no,
wait.
no. That's a P. That's a P. You had that one. The last name is, or the first name is Jazz, Jasbir.
Okay, I
Right.
got it finally.
Yeah. Lots about disability, lots about queerness. There's a whole book about Israel-Palestine conflict. Puar is a very, very interesting author. We wrote a Puar AF on the ICC topic that was really, really good, based on the book. I think the book is called Homo Nationalism. Um, yeah, it's like a subtitle in the book. I don't know. Go book cut it. He just kind of yapped my head off about it for a couple weeks, but it seemed fun. It was a good AF. I liked it. Yeah. So again, we can get as optimistic or pessimistic as we want there. A lot of the stuff is generally about the state managing life systems and intentionally maintaining disability. So you might see that in relationship, especially to like the nuclear waste literature, right? Because there's a lot on how like nuclear waste creates disability in communities, whether that's through contaminating water supplies, food supplies, that kind of thing, increased radiation causing cancers, all that sort of stuff. So that would likely be your best avenue for exploring this kind of literature on this topic, would be the kind of waste angle. And as you're seeing, right, this is why I thought, Plano did such a good job at the TOC of answering the K that they saw, because so much of decay was about like zones of sacrifice and, nuclear waste creating these disposable communities. And so they just read their link terms on that about like nuclear waste recycling, about, increased investment, helping with cleanup initiatives, that sort of thing, right? And so, if people's link arguments are just interesting reasons why waste is bad, your waste arguments still answer it, right? And so I really I'm hoping going through this discussion will clarify for a lot of people, this is not a different debate, right? We are just looking at and caring about different impacts, right?
Yeah,
Cool, cool, cool. Um,
definitely cool.
well, yeah.
Uh, One thing I wanted to flag in disability studies is I noticed that people are reading a lot of disability type Ks in PF recently. Also, they tend to be very non-topical, so look out for that. But one thing I wanted to flag is that there's a term of ableism that flies around in the literature that people are treating as like a link word. Like if you highlight the word ableism, you have a link to disability studies, which is not the case. The way that this word is treated in disability studies literature is actually not as a negative term. It could be a positive even. It's neutral. Ableism just means that every world has a hierarchy of what kind of abilities they prioritize, and what kind of abilities they think are important. And that is something that's apparently like inherent and inevitable according to the literature. It becomes negative when this hierarchy of abilities that is prioritized is exclusive to certain individuals or groups of individuals and creates this kind of permanent vulnerability, and structures the world such that these people are more vulnerable. But it doesn't, like, just because you found the word ableism in a card, I don't think necessarily grants you a link.
Yeah, I think that's very reasonable. Yeah. Um, and I agree with what you're saying, right? This is a very common non-topical argument, especially, people read it as a response to theory a lot, or frankly, as a response to things people just don't understand. The spikes K, for example, is a really, really common thing that we see where, people don't do a great job of differentiating what constitutes a spike, but they'll just say, reading analytics is ableist. And I would really encourage people to be a little more careful with that. I would say don't just because you don't like a practice uncritically just say it's ableist without, kind of specifying what group of people are harmed or hurt or harmed or benefit even, from particular practices in debate. I've always found it a bit ironic, somebody calling something ableist while spreading at 400 words per minute and, not in English. There's like a lot of nuance to this discussion I think is lost when people just like, blip out independent voters, right?
Yeah, definitely. Totally agree on that.
All right, ready for the next one?
Yes.
All right, so we're going to group a couple different arguments together here under the kind of banner of colonialism. Um, Note that this can mean so many different things. Learning debate is so hard, There's so many phrases like liberal, right? We we've probably used the phrase liberal to mean three different things in this discussion already.
Yeah.
So frustrating. We got to get more creative with our words, right? But so colonialism, right? Colonialism just at its core is what? Like taking over something and dating the fruits back to an original, I guess, person. I guess at its core, that would probably be what it is, right? But in debate, we'll see a lot of different versions of it. So the three phrases I want to like kind of highlight are settler colonialism, post-colonialism, and neocolonialism. These are not exhaustive. There's oddly more, right? But these are the kind of three basic ideas you'll see like thrown around a lot in debate, and you'll see them used kind of interchangeably in ways that often lead to double turns. But for the purposes of this discussion, we'll kind of talk about all of them. So I think let's start with post-colonialism because I think that's the simplest. I get it's two,
Okay.
but so post-colonialism is looking at how previous colonialism is shaping current outcomes, right? So this might explore, for example, how France's status as a global superpower for a couple hundred years and its maintenance of colonies, all over Africa and Asia, how that relates to its position as a current nuclear superpower, or its position as a leader in the European Union, right? So that's what post-colonialism is looking at. You'll see post-colonialism literature a lot in, global warming discussions, right? Looking at how, 100 years of industrialization on the other side of the globe that was driven by, raw materials from the global south, how that's now, destroying people in the global south, right? Or how current supply chains sort of mirror the global slave trade and how that kind of like built in advantages for certain groups of people that we're now seeing the outcomes on, right? But the important part of post-colonial theory is it's looking backwards to describe current outcomes, right? Very interesting type of literature, right? I think it is impossible to study global history or sort of sorry global politics without understanding global history, right? You really do need a lot of context for why things are the way they are, and that's what post-colonialism literature really seeks to help with, right? So that's post-colonialism. Um, as part of that, we'll also discuss um, sort of worldviews that have entrenched themselves over, the centuries and how those are kind of dictating current outcomes, right? This is where you'll hear the phrase Orientalism used a lot. This is from the book Orientalism by Edward Said. Um, Really, really great book. I recommend everyone read it, not just for debate, but for life. It's a little bit outdated at this point, and you can usually find updated versions for the particular context of what you're trying to study. But I guarantee. I don't know how you all search, but for critical literature, I really like using Google Scholar
Yeah.
because in Google Scholar, and maybe you can show them this real quick, you can go and look up the book, right? So if we just wanted to go on Google Scholar, we could just look up Orientalism, right? Um, and then
Boom.
we've got the actual book there. And then if you click cited by right down there below it, see where it says cited by? And now
Yeah.
important step, search within citing articles. See at the top? So now that'll make it so we're only searching within the, what was it, 1,300 books that have actually cited Edward Said's book. So now if we wanted to search for nuclear sharing, for example, um, now we know there's what, I didn't even see how many it said, right? But now we know there's
64.
64 results that are referencing his book and nuclear sharing, right? And if we put that in quotation marks, we could guarantee that we got that exact phrase, right? Um,
Oh,
and
zero.
so there are no books. Yeah, yeah, right. Unsurprising. It's a very specific thing, right? But if we wanted to look at nuclear proliferation or whatever, right? So that's kind of an interesting way of doing it. I'll admit I don't do that terribly often, just because second, third layer sources are usually sufficient for debate. But for actual academic research, that is something I used all the time in graduate school. I'm a big fan of the cited by feature. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
can I one more real
yeah.
quick?
Oh yeah.
This one is one that I will caution you against using because I do believe it might be not allowed. But if we go in here, this is a great way to avoid finding books that you can download for free, including books like Orientalism. You can just completely download them through a number of different, or you should avoid completely downloading them for free through a number of different channels. They won't all always work, but I have never had a problem with it when I've been avoiding it. And it has not saved me a lot of money throughout university.
No. I would never. Yeah, so Orientalism, though, is looking at essentially the exact same thing we talked about before in terms of humanism, but applying it to the East versus the West, right? And so it's saying that essentially Europe was able to identify itself as civilization by defining themselves as not, you know, what they defined as the Orient, right? Now, these are obviously not natural categories of the world, right? These are human constructions that we have given meaning. And so Said is just looking at all of the various different contexts where our Orientalism is shining through, right? You'll see it in a lot of different discussions. But I thought one of the more fascinating discussions, I mean, the first time I interacted with his literature was in the context of the nuclear apartheid, he called it, right? So, apartheid was famously a term used during South African apartheid, where there were two distinct essential populaces living within South Africa. You had the whites that controlled everything, and then the black people that controlled nothing, right? Nelson Mandela tried to, change all this with all their kind of revolutionary actions, right? And so apartheid has become a phrase that is used to denote like this sort of formal separation, right? Almost like a separate legal and political system for different people, right? And so when people are talking about nuclear apartheid, what they're essentially saying is we've created a distinct legal and political category based on your proximity to the West, your proximity to whiteness, right? And the United States will live or die by these kinds of exclusions or inclusions, right? Primarily meaning, it's mostly white people with nuclear weapons, and we're fine with it when our other white friends get nuclear weapons, but we're gonna overreact when we think people outside of that kind of like Western civilized human are seeking nuclear weapons, right? And so you'll see a lot of literature about like what that kind of containment looks like, what nuclear taboos really are, and why there's always that kind of double standard. With a country with 10,000 nuclear weapons actively spending hundreds of billions of dollars modernizing them, how they're looking at one country with one weapon and calling them the devil. So that's kind of the basic post-colonial Orientalism type discussion. Another scholar you'll see coming up in that literature a lot is Walter Mignolo. Really big fan of him.
How do you spell
M-I-G,
this?
yeah, yeah, Mignolo, Mignolo. I don't think that's how you pronounce it, and I think I'm honestly butchering a lot of these pronunciations, right? Which I used to feel really, really bad about, and then somebody said to me, "That just means you learned through reading. So why are you ashamed of reading?" And I was like, that's facts. Not everyone can afford to go to school, right? Like, I like to read. I've learned to read. Some of these names I do try. Look it up on YouTube, but yeah, Walter Mignolo. Um, Really great Latin American scholar talking about all of this same stuff, just in the context of, the US and our relationship with our southern neighbors, right? But a lot of the same discussion, cites Said all the time. Yeah. So that's the basic post-colonialism one. So the other one we can talk about is neocolonialism. I know I've gone in like completely not the right order. But that's because like set call, in debate, it's like an every round discussion. And in the real world, it's just like not because it really only applies to a couple of countries. So we'll just go in the order that makes sense in my brain. Neocolonialism. So this is where we're identifying new structures in the world that replicate colonial patterns, right? So new colonialism, right? So for example, if I was criticizing like the IMF or the World Bank for creating new systems of like debt entrapment, right? We'll say, IMF World Bank gives someone a loan for $100 billion, they can't pay it back. So now all of a sudden the World Bank is like coming in and being like, okay, you need to engage in austerity measures. You need to cut your fuel subsidies. Oh, by the way, you need to make sure you're using the American dollar. Oh no, if you switch away from the American dollar, we're going to make sure that you owe us even more. you better not switch away from the American dollar, right? So see how they're using this tool that they have at their disposal, right? The international financial system, right, as a tool of colonialism to get their way, right? So instead of relying on traditional military forces, gunboat diplomacy, where you've got some frigates with 100 guns sitting in the bay, right? Now we have more robust and nuanced tools for maintaining power, right? Sometime around the middle of the 1800s, governments were like, oh, wow, we cannot keep doing this with force. These people are going to rise up, they're going to kill us. So we got to be a little bit more subtle about this. And so neocolonialism is all about identifying these various rituals, projects, tools that those in power have to subtly behind the scenes maintain forms of colonization, right? So here, this is where you might find literature talking about how nuclear sharing agreements or, intra-governmental organizations like the European Union, right? Why these various things are just methods of maintaining control, right? Maybe you'll find some stuff about how this is France exerting its will over Ireland. I don't know. Again, once we get to the specifics of nuclear sharing, a lot of these arguments are you're not going to have like the most specific links, but in general terms of like nuclear power, nuclear taboos, you'll see a lot of stuff. So, questions on neocol.
I don't think I have any questions. One thing I was reminded of is I've been reading a little bit of Foucault recently, and this feels like very parallel. Like Foucault is all about how systems of punishment, for example, that used to exist were very public, very gory, very like violent. And then the body shifted toward being more pernicious, toward being more controlled, more like specific rigid schedules for being a prisoner, when you can do things, what kinds of things you're allowed to do, being kept in like a box away from the public eye. And his whole thesis is like, this is not decrease the violence. This is not decrease, like, this is not a morally better system that we have now. And I think this is the same kind of thing just applied to colonialism.
Yeah, so I thought, what was that, discipline and punish?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that I think so. Foucault is very much one of the scholars when I was kind of growing up in like learning policy debate for the first time. Foucault was kind of the thing you introduce people to because once you start understanding biopower and I think discipline and punish is just such a tangible view of yeah, it used to be you're out in a square watching someone get their head chopped off and rulers thought that imagery was what held you in line, right? And then the French Revolution kind of flipped that on its head, and that symbol stopped kind of working, yeah, and they just had to get more subtle about it. And absolutely, yeah, I mean, a lot of these scholars would be running in very similar or drawing on very similar influences, right? When we get to the security K, you'll see very, very similar influences. They all of them read Foucault when they were in grad school. Absolutely. Yeah, 100%. And this is also why I think it is just like fundamental to study history if you want to be good at debate, IR, any of that. Because like if you don't understand what happened in the French Revolution, how that changed, like how that set up Napoleon, how that led to the end of monarchy, how that led to the birth of capitalism globally. Like there's just like so many of these little things that I feel like if you just like don't have that historical context for it, reading a lot of this literature is just like you have no idea what they're talking about because there's just like a shared assumption of historical knowledge that I just don't think like many Americans like really are prepared for. I think honestly that might be why they find K debate so confusing is less like all the terminology and a lot more of just like, man, our history classes are so boring and kids don't learn a lot of this stuff.
Yeah.
Okay. Ready?
Ready.
Last one is set call, settler colonialism. So this is a very particular brand of colonialism literature that is looking at what happens when the colonizers come to stay. So when they're looking for a new home and wipe out the indigenous people and replace them, right? So these other ones are looking at more of like systems of top-down control. whereas settler colonialism is like adding on that genocide element to it, right? So this is a discussion that you'll see usually in relation to Australia, New Zealand, the United States, and disputed whether or not Israel counts, but you'll see a lot of discussions with the phrase settler colonialism used in the context of Israel, right? So these are very particular cases where settler colonialism is relevant. This is why, for example, I find it very frustrating when people read settler colonialism on like a completely foreign topic that has is just not about settler colonial nations, right? You'll see like some discussion of IR and post-colonialism, and then there's like a set call alt that just like wouldn't resolve it, right? Like I don't know why the US giving back the land would do anything to fix the United Nations Security Council, operating in a way that excludes other nations. Or you see how these are just like different discussions, even though they're both, using the word colonialism, they're just like very different contexts, right? And so this is something, if you actually go through our colonialism master file, I put the country that's relevant at the top of each link card so you can tell whether or not you can like kind of use them together, right? Because there's some instances where yeah you would just find yourself very much talking about different things. So settler colonialism is the pessimistic brand of colonialism literature, right? This is the scholars are going to be very much focused on giving back the land, making sure that the decision making and physical power is in the hands of indigenous people. A lot of initially Patrick Wolf was one of the big scholars in the settler colonialism field from like the Australian, New Zealand context. In the United States, Tuck and Yang are kind of your like really big ones that you'll see. That's Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang. You'll see them all the time, right? Rifkin is another one that you'll see a lot, less so in literature and more so in debate. There's just a card that you see a ton. Tiffany King, who we talked about in the anti-blackness literature, also writes a lot about settler colonialism. There's tons of authors. Audra Mitchell is another really good one I like. Yeah, so lots of discussions here. In terms of nuclear weapons with settler colonialism, I think that the answer should be this should not be your approach, right? Because um, not really the historical context of France. And so, you know, a little less relevance, right? But you'll see a lot of non-topical AFs related to settler colonialism. Um, on account of us being on stolen land when we're debating. There's a lot of academy Ks, so critiques of academic discussions from a settler colonial perspective, especially from American higher education, where a lot of it happens on stolen land with, you know, places built by slave labor, right? Like the places we're debating physically, a lot of them, are very much built by slave labor. And so there'll be a lot of like non-topical discussions like that. But yeah, I don't think you'll see much or nuclear sharing with settler colonialism. Not that it's impossible, but yeah. Oh, that sound good?
Yeah, sounds great. This is
Yeah.
great. I feel like this is wonderful context.
Yeah. So I think that colonialism is just would be one of the better neg strategies that you can go for. I think it's very simple. It's very intuitive concepts, very persuasive. There are very few people who will, in the back of a room with children admit that they think genocide is a good thing. Um, there's probably are some, right? Not in a lot of debates we have. Um, it gives you a lot of flexibility in terms of literature. Like I said, there's a lot of different approaches that we can like sort of piece together into a pretty coherent argument. And then I also really like it because I think it makes it really easy to switch your offense between Phil and K offense, right? A lot of the offense that we would read under any of these critiques with colonialism would work really well for a relationality framework that we will talk about when we get to the philosophy discussion, right? So this is the route I would recommend starting with. I think it gives you a good reason to read about the history of France and the European Union, which will help you both in, topical lay debates and in your tech K rounds. I think it gives you a good introduction into a type of literature that will exist on most topics. So when you're getting your front lines together, that's not time you're going to waste if you don't end up using it on this topic. Um, and also, I just find this literature fairly persuasive and interesting. So, I mean, if I was watching this lecture, the phrase nuclear apartheid piques my interest. That sounds fascinating, and so I would definitely. This is where I would start if I was a wayward student looking for a path.
Definitely.
All right, we good to move on?
Yeah. On to the next.
All right, so somewhat related concept that you'll see a lot is the security K. So we're getting into the sort of realm of intersectionality, and by that I mean we're getting into the point where we're kind of mixing a lot of different arguments, lenses from a lot of this literature, and coming to the point where we're getting these kinds of interesting outpoints. So security K essentially just says that uh, security isn't some natural or neutral thing that exists in the world, but it is a state that is essentially fetishized by those in power to have malleable kind of narratives that allow them to justify expanded power. So it essentially says that states are able to use amorphous threats, and it is important that they are amorphous, that they're unknowable, that they could happen at any given time, right? And states use those to justify expansion of their own power. So a lot of link arguments we'll hear in security case will be about identifying whatever threat the AFORNEG has identified, and then proving that that is just an over exaggerated, sort of threat designed to try to increase the power of, XYZ group of people, right? One really interesting, study that we always talk about with this kind of literature is and I'm very much so butchering the numbers, but it was something like 98% of bombs or something like that made it through TSA at an airport, right? The point being that TSA isn't there to actually prevent threats, right? It is there to convince you that these threats are real, that terrorism is an ever present, like just right there threat. So that, when the government says we need to bomb Iran, you're like, I mean, I guess we need to bomb Iran, right? These terrorists are about to slip into the Nashville airport if they didn't make me take my shoes off, right? And so the security K is all about identifying these kind of security rituals, and both how they, invest certain people with power, right? Who do we identify as a security expert? Why does that give them, sort of unique credibility in our minds, right? And how are we manipulated through fear and control, right? So I think obviously this discussion pretty closely aligns with this topic, right? What does it mean to kind of normalize a constant state of war, right? Realistically, the topic is saying we need to keep French nukes flying all over Europe at all times to always be ready to go to war. Like what does that do, to the people there? How does that playing on their emotions? What types of, conflict are we normalizing, right? Some scholars you'll see related to this. Richard Jackson is one you'll see a lot in debate. Love those cards. Ozcan, Ozcan. I don't remember the first name, to be honest. That was a card I cut a minute ago. Um, yeah, these are going to be your, there's other authors. Actually, Mignolo talks a lot about security in the context of the war on drugs in Latin America. We talked about that in terms of Orientalism, that kind of, you see them all applied together. Oddly enough, the Foucault stuff that you were talking about is referenced a lot in security K literature, especially, this idea of the panopticon, right? Which is essentially a prison where you don't even really need more than one prison guard because at all times everyone thinks that they're being watched by that prison guard because they don't know whether or not they are, closely associated with the concept of biopower you were talking about with Foucault, which is just like the idea of, us as individuals holding each other accountable, right? It seeks to answer the question, why do people, stop at a stoplight in the middle of the night, you know? In any event, all of this kind of literature is looking at kind of subtle manipulations of fear to generate control, right? And you can imagine on a deterrence topic, which is literally the essence of capturing fear and using it to kind of like have a policy outcome, right? That this will be the topic neg on it, right? Very much so. Anything you're looking at will likely sort of go through the security K lens. Any questions
Yeah.
there?
No, this, I think if there's a K that I would expect to be most likely or should be most likely, I think it's this one, to be honest.
Yeah,
Um,
I agree.
on
And
this
like
topic,
I said, I think a lot of them will be very relevant together, right? Like, for example, you will very much have like they are manipulating fear of brown terrorists to justify expansion of, nationalist immigration policies or to justify austerity policies where they're cutting social welfare because they're like, pretending like these brown people are coming to steal your healthcare, right? Like all of these things happen together, right? Absolutely, right? And so yeah, any meaningful discussion of, security, and this is why, I was telling you a post-colonial author is writing about security in the context of the war on drugs in Latin America, right? Because they are all very interrelated things. No, absolutely. Yeah.
yeah,
Cool.
100%.
Some other
Are there,
authors you
yeah,
might see associated with that, if we kind of bleed biopolitics, necropolitics, and security all kind of together, right? You'll see Foucault, you'll see Membe a lot, Akil Membe, Achille. Agamben is another one you'll see, which Agamben had this phrase, "bear life," um, not like a bear, like yeah, like that. Um, it's just essentially like life without like the kind of human characteristics. It's something I think about a lot, right? Like it's almost like you treat people like they're NPCs or you turn people into NPCs. Um, a phrase you'll see used a lot in like the anti-blackness literature is fungible, right? Meaning like perfectly interchangeable, like a dollar is, right? Like every dollar is the same as every other dollar, right? And so humans are obviously just not fungible, right? We're all so unique and just like different, completely different, right? And so, in anti-blackness literature, they would say that, civil society renders black people as fungible, replaceable, interchangeable, right? Um, and so, you'll see the same thing associated with the phrase bare life a lot in Agamben. I don't know. I found the phrase bare life very informative to me. I think I was like reckoning with South Florida and like trying to imagine living here without a car or sunglasses. And it feels like it's lacking those distinct human characteristics. All right. So I know we burned through a lot of phrases real quick there, but a lot of them are fairly related arguments. Another fairly related argument to a lot of this is the capitalism critique. Um, I will say pretty much every single argument we've talked about so far is a cap K at some level. Um, in debate, there are some times we will differentiate the cap K, but as a coach, I generally don't um, teach cap Ks as topical K arguments. I usually focus on them as answers to identity Ks, uh, because I think most Ks are better served being a bit more specific, right? There's definitely some topics, especially economy topics, right? Like if something's about a minimum wage or something like that, where, we might delve into the Cap K literature. But for the most part, I think the links are usually better served on a different K. So the reason for that is I think Cap K framing is a bit outdated, right? This is just global capitalism is bad. It turns war into a militarized profit-making industry. And so we're going to look at how nuclear deterrence, functions as a way of ensuring accumulation, right? So all we're looking at with the cap K is how does your action make it easier to, keep poor people down, to maintain hierarchies between the rich and the poor, right? So a lot of what we've talked about with all of these Ks is, identifying very nuanced ways that this is happening, right? Because obviously, I mean, we all know ultimately the final goal of all this is money. I think that there are additional layers to it, right? I mean, I think that there are a lot of racists who, are racist even in the face of that hurting them economically, right? I'm not saying like ultimately the only human drive is maintaining sort of class division or material happiness, right? I think that humans are obviously very complicated, but I will say I think most of these links still at some level are alluding to larger capitalist drives, and so I don't tend to usually feel the need to differentiate any of these arguments as like cap Ks per se, right? Usually with a cap K, you're going to have like some communism alternative, which is where I think people have answers to, which is why I tend to avoid it, right? But it tends to work fairly well against non-topical identity AFs, right? Because you get to focus on, no, we need broad-based coalitions, not, identifying segments of the working class and, dividing, right? The argument is essentially that identity politics is a sort of bourgeois tool to divide the proletariat so they can't rise up against these kind of like larger power structures. Um, and so, you know, some authors you'll see associated with this. Jody Dean is the big one you'll see. Escalante is another one you'll see a lot, especially in the identity politics literature. We could talk honestly for 2 hours about Cap K versus identity politics, and we probably should at some point, right? But yeah, that
Yeah,
is like kind of your basic. Yeah, but that's a totally separate topic. Yeah,
yeah,
that would be your basic discussion on this topic. So that is all the like sort of all of the like structural kind of identity Ks. The next grouping of Ks we're going to talk about are collectively called our high theory Ks. Um, Again, I'm going to try to move fairly quickly through these because each of these could use their own hour. High theory is a phrase that is only associated with debate, as far as I understand, that just tends to group an era of scholarship. This is our kind of postmodern, post-structuralist era of philosophy. Most postmodern and post-structuralist philosophers would never ever agree that they are postmodern or post-structuralist philosophers. It's kind of like a paradox of like, your postmodern philosophers are your like anti-everything hipsters. And so of course they're never going to identify as a particular category. I literally don't think I've ever heard of a postmodern scholar admitting that they're postmodern, right? But these general philosophies are generally treated as like weird, I guess. I find them very informative. Um, as a group, these trying to find a through line between all this is kind of fun. All right, as a group, I would say all of these philosophers are looking at kind of secondary meanings of things. Um, does that unify them? I guess maybe, right? Kind of. That's probably more post-structuralist, but they're more of looking. They're trying to identify what is or isn't real, how symbols and signs in the world are kind of like shaping outcomes, shaping our understanding of things, how various rituals that we engage in kind of like create our reality, right? And so as we get into all of this stuff, I'm going to use a lot of phrases. And I think the important thing to say is all of these scholars think the world is real, like in a physical materialist sense, right? So uh, none of these scholars are like Nick Bostrom postulating we live in an actual simulation, like Rick and Morty style. That's just like not what we're talking about with these philosophers, right? So a lot of these philosophers are skeptics of the world, right? They sort of take things with a grain of salt. But that doesn't mean that these people like wholly reject reality, right? I think that there is like a lot of mischaracterization that happens with some of these philosophers that I dislike. So the first kind of group of scholars I'll talk about is the existentialists. The existentialists. So existentialism is a massive grouping of philosophy. Some scholars you'll see associated with it, and I'm really going to throw you for a loop with your spelling on this one. We've got Kierkegaard. How do we do?
Wait. Kierkegaard.
Kierkegaard. Okay, you nailed it. All right, great.
No.
Sartre. Sartre. Okay, good. Camus. De Beauvoir.
Oh shit, I don't know it.
I
It's
think
like
it's something
um
like that. It's very French. De
wait.
Beauvoir.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wait, it's okay.
Yeah, second one. Simone de
Okay,
Beauvoir.
okay.
Yeah. Beauvoir. Yeah. Um. Oh man, no, I forgot. I lost my track. Oh, Nietzsche. Come on.
Each
Yeah. There's more. I mean, we could put Deleuze. We could put, um, yeah, Heidegger. A lot of these people are existentialists, even if that is not like the core of their discussion, right? Because the basic idea here is just like, well, actually, I would take Heidegger off that actually, for other reasons. Uh, I think actually it is possible to claim he's not an existentialist, but I don't think so. Um, in any event, all of these philosophers are essentially just saying that the idea of human, what it means to be human, our intended purpose, our morality, all of that, right, is not something we are born into the world with, right? That would be an essentialist. They would say we are born with, you know, all the things I just listed, right? But all of these scholars are essentially saying we are not, born with any purpose, but we have to create that purpose on the world here and now, right? This is clearly a repudiation of religion, right? Which is why the phrase "God is dead" is so often associated with Nietzsche. There's more context to that that's not as clear of a statement as a lot of people make it out to be, but clearly this is a repudiation of any kind of universalist understanding of the world, right, coming before it. So this would be a critique of utilitarianism, of, Kantian deontology, of, every kind of religious moral philosophy, anything that, claims that, we're born with a particular purpose in mind, right? Even like Platonism or the cosmic purpose nonsense we read, all of that would be largely criticized by existentialism. So typically these philosophers are a lot of your freedom philosophers, right? Because part of that kind of like existential freedom is also existential responsibility. When you can't like kind of outsource your morality to somebody else, it becomes your kind of responsibility. And so there's lots of different ways of using this literature for good and bad, right? Simone de Beauvoir, for example, and I believe it was The Second Sex, I want to say. Yes. Talks about existentialism in the context of feminism as like, a justification for why women aren't born with this inherent purpose of being, a spouse, right? You can use these kind of like this criticism of like the preordained structures of the world really to just, I mean, honestly, this just sounds like hey literature, right? Like existentialism really just is like kind of the broader sort of realm of everything we're talking about today, right? um, you know, apply. I mean, honestly, like Wilderson is writing based on Fanon, who you should also add to the list of existentialists, right? Um, Same kind of concept. Fanon was trying to understand, what it means to be black in Algeria under French occupation, right? Having a lot of these kind of like similar discussions, right? So I think Nietzsche, though, is a pretty interesting approach for this topic, especially in the context of IR. So I'm of the opinion Nietzsche would just like fully be a realist, right? I think Nietzsche would just be fully on board with like, if you don't seek nuclear weapons, other people are going to. And so you'll just be left on your own in the woods with no nuclear weapons, and that's a bad way to live, right? Um, I think Nietzsche would be very critical, though, of the idea of relying on another person for your kind of security. So I think, Nietzsche could negate, right? Nietzsche could also very much say that, your fear, using fear as like a driving force behind your kind of decision making, which is very much what like a nuclear deterrence policy would do, would also very much negate, right? It's a very weak will to power to like always be thinking about, somebody else, right? So I think that there's reasons it could exist on both sides, but I think ultimately Nietzsche would not be super comfortable with like a fear obsessed kind of policy. It's weird because I think he'd be a realist in a sense of like maintaining strength, but I also think wouldn't want to rely on someone else for strength. And definitely there's, weird context about the general idea of deterrence, but definitely worth looking into if you all want to explore Nietzsche's understanding of deterrence. I guarantee there's an article or two, and I think you'd probably learn something from him. Um, yeah, so existentialism. Do you have questions?
Um, yes, but maybe for the sake of time, we should hold off on them a little bit.
Okay. If you have one question, I'm looking up an article really quick.
Okay, I'm just finishing these notes. All right. So all of this is about how there's no preordained purpose or obligations that you have. Um, I guess my question about this is how do existential philosophers conceptualize a morality if it's not universal? Like how does one go about constructing their own personal morality? And is there a right or wrong way, or does that sort of create a contradiction with existentialism?
Totally depends on which existentialist you're talking about, how they conclude that discussion. I think de Beauvoir, for example, has, pretty decent reasons why it creates an obligation to the other. I think Nietzsche has pretty, in my mind, uncompelling reasons why it sort of means that we need to just like embrace our will to power. But I would say most of these people are going to be just like kind of critical of the idea of normativity, generally of universal ethics. They would all say it is very situational, that there's not really a right answer, right? Looking for like a neat tidy package of morality with existentialism is going to be a bit of an uphill battle, is what I would say.
Yeah.
Typically
So,
we'll read it then as like a procedural argument, about protecting people's freedom to make decisions, essentially.
okay,
Yeah.
interesting. My
Which is
question
what
then is
it's what you'll typically read whenever you're reading something as a criticism of universalism. Is it then becomes like a procedural question of like
yeah.
protecting your ability to access that kind of ethical deliberation.
Yeah. My question is like, doesn't this create some sort of contradiction? Like, why is it important to protect freedom?
Oh yeah, I mean you could ask why endlessly in a circle with almost all these arguments. 100%, right?
Okay. My thought is just like, it seems like debate, like the resolution itself poses a question that maybe assumes an answer, even if it's not a universal answer, like a situational answer, some answer. And so my question is, how do existentialist philosophers go about making prescriptions on others?
Well, you probably wouldn't, right? At least not regularly, right? Um, so I would say you wouldn't, right? Would be my answer, right? But also, I would say that at least in a debate context, um, if we get down to that level, we're probably triggering skepticism at that point, right?
Yeah,
If we have one that like it is, if you're going to concede that like creating an obligation is impossible and we're negative, like, well, the AF is a proactive statement, so um, okay. Obviously, like we will have workarounds to this, and that's where you get into the like procedural stuff about like it's protecting people's ability to self-legislate, right? Um, it, you know, that's where you end up going down to it. Yeah, but existentialism is a repudiation of normative ethics. It is not a normative ethic. So
yeah, that makes sense. It's interesting.
it
I feel
is,
like
it is.
the best way to learn more about this is go read.
Yeah, yeah. You kind of, and honestly, all the authors we listed are gonna have such like wildly different takes on this. Like reading Nietzsche to me is nothing like reading Fanon. I mean, Fon.
F, really? Wait, like that?
I think it's two O's. Fanon. Fanon.
F
Franz.
A O N.
Yeah.
Ah, I see, I see. Okay.
Yeah. Fanon and Camus both died very early, so we don't have much literature from them, unfortunately. Okay, next one, Bataille. This lecture is already really long, so I'm not going to spend more time on this than needs be. Bataille is the solar excess stuff. It says that essentially the sun puts off more energy than humans can make use of, and because of that, we expend that excess in violent ways. Um, so we shouldn't do that. Nuclear weapons are kind of the ultimate example of this excess, right? It's us pouring all of this kind of like energy into unproductive, or I guess like productive mechanisms of control. And so, you know, the AF is, I guess, like treating this kind of destruction or this nuclear weapon as sacred, or maybe like a fetish object might be something that Bataille would say. I'm not the most familiar with Bataille. Most of my interactions with it are, you know, reading the kind of anthropology stuff because I was so into Baudrillard for a while that like you run into kind of the same currents of like mid 1900s history from like Carl Levi Strauss and stuff like that. And then the other was just like I spent a lot of time answering it at the TOC, and I didn't find anything like unique and interesting in it beyond what I just said. So I wouldn't devote too much time to it. I think there's the kind of interesting, remember you were talking about like a pick for that round, something about like um, what was it picking out of
It's like,
uh
oh, it was the invest word pick.
yeah. Yeah. I think there was that one. And then there was the, what is it, like fusion is
Yeah,
creating.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Don't do fusion because it's just mini suns.
Yeah. So I don't know. Maybe people will come up with something for this. I always trust a dedicated Pomo debater to make whatever topic they want work. So it's worth like having some answers to Bataille, but that would not be how I approach it. Baudrillard, not at all similar. I was about to say similar philosopher, similar vein, I guess, sort of. Somewhat similar era, somewhat similar like people that they're drawing from. Um, but Baudrillard to me is a very interesting philosopher. He is to me like just really smart, just so good at predicting the future. He saw a lot of trends, I think, in the 80s and 90s that, were people are, grappling with the implications today. And this dude like predicted it back then. Like it was so interesting reading on a social media topic with like 50 quotes from Baudrillard who like died before social media was ever really a thing. I mean not died, but certainly was writing before it was ever like a big thing. So Baudrillard essentially theorizes that the modern world is built through symbols and simulations, that we live so much through media and media spectacle, and various kind of rituals that we all perform, that the way we experience the world is no longer through interacting with the real world, but through interacting with a simulation of what we think the real world is, right? A phrase, I think back to this song. Let's say it was Young Fathers from Typhoon. I actually think it's a song I showed you. Um,
Yeah, I have it.
yeah. And there's like a line about, visions from a film we'll never know. And I hear that line all the time, and I always just think to myself, yeah, I mean, when I hear about nuclear deterrence, I am inevitably imagining like a movie in my head and like think I am actually understanding the real world when I'm just, understanding a copy of a copy, right? And in some instances, a copy of a copy of a copy, right? I mean, the person who made the movie about nuclear deterrence is probably not learning about nuclear weapons firsthand. They're probably looking at a picture of a painting of a drawing. And so, short of us having a 2 hour lecture on just Baudrillard, which I would love, and we did last year as part of the program, right? The basic idea here would just be that deterrence renders war unreal, right? War becomes a lot more about the hyper real image of control. Um, it becomes more about the symbols and signals that we send to each other. Um, Instead of being about like meaningful security, right? So Baudrillard talks a lot about war. He had a three-part series. The Gulf War is not going to happen, the Gulf War isn't happening, and the Gulf War didn't happen. And all three were just kind of like analyze. I think there's a like pretty close to the exact titles. Um, and the basic idea is just like, we experienced so much of that particular war through like on the ground, like, journalism that made us feel like we were there, right? And so, it really led us to believe like we understood war like no generation previously, right? And so, just kind of like an interesting inflammatory titles that drew people in to hopefully kind of like get at a larger truth. So this is what we, read in TOC finals last year was, Baudrillard discussion of war, of it all being political theater, right? Um, and I think this would work really well on this topic. Now, whether that affirms or negates is totally up to how you want to read it, how satirical you want to be with it. Baudrillard went through three very like big, clear, distinct kind of waves of his philosophy that got increasingly pessimistic and a little more what we would call accelerationist, meaning it got a bit more focused on making signs meaningless, like kind of trying to collapse the system in on itself. A phrase you'll hear a lot used with this is like a judo flip, which I guess my understanding is this is like a move in karate or taekwondo or something where you're like using your opponent's weight against them. So like, when they go in for the swing, you use their momentum to topple them, right? Is basically like his metaphor for how we approach challenging the system, right? A phrase I remember from a card a lot is we like dare the system to do its worst, right? So because of the nature of that kind of like thinking, you can usually make Baudrillard work on either side of the topic, either by exacerbating, whatever the kind of issue it is you're talking about, or by just like, topically explaining why something is good or bad. I will say you really run the risk with accelerationist philosophy of sounding really problematic, because, to me, the logical first question against this is, so you say that we should do problematic things, right? Yeah. Okay, so I should say the N word 100 times in this round to like make it lose its meaning, right? And I don't know how they don't say yes to that. Like it just seems like you're categorically disregarding the philosophy if you say no. And so I don't really know how you win or solve, right? So there's lots of, ways I would kind of avoid accelerationist stuff, even if I think a lot of the link evidence and the descriptions of the rituals that happen in the world, I think are very poignant and interesting. Thoughts, questions?
What do you mean by hyperreal? I know that
Oh,
this is like a term
yeah,
that
yeah.
we've heard
Yeah, yeah,
before.
yeah. So you remember when I was saying that like something is an image of an image of an image, right? So what Baudrillard is postulating is that essentially we are so consumed by these like third order images in the world that we are no longer experiencing the real world. We are experiencing the hyper real world, right?
Yeah. It makes, I mean, honestly, like when I learned about this a few years ago, I was the first thing was like, what the heck? This doesn't make any
Yeah.
sense. And also like, why does he think we're in a simulation? Clearly like
Yeah.
correct. But the more I have thought about it, like in the past few years, the more this like really hits home for me. I feel like it is so true that like everything I think I know about the world is like images of images of, it's like this is the same thing Plato, I think, said as well. It's
Mhm.
like we are this is like the allegory of the cave, right? You know, I
Yeah,
guess they have a slightly different stance on like who's casting the shadows.
right.
But
Often you'll see the allegory of the cave as a starting point of an explanation of hyperreality
yeah, it makes
in
sense.
like
But
Phil classes, right?
yeah, yeah, but it makes so much sense in today's world with like, I mean, not just with social, like, what are we doing right now? Like, I'm sitting on this computer writing a document in this language about concepts that you're explaining that you've read in books that are about, like, it's like
I mean, I'm
so
not, dude, I'm
hard.
not out here reading primary source Baudrillard. Like, I read a couple of the articles, but
Yeah, yeah, literally.
I'm not reading Sim and Sim. No, I'm reading the secondary sources contextualized to a particular, topic, hoping that they did the hard work of making sure it made sense.
Right. And like
Remember,
it's the same with even the most material things. Like, I think I understand French politics. I think I understand US politics, but that is just symbols. It's symbols all the way down. And the thing is, I think what Baudrillard's getting here at this point is like hyper reality, it comes back on itself. It's not just that you are missing the truth, it's that you're creating the truth, right? Like the truth of US politics, for instance, is the symbols. It is the media. It is what you're consuming on social media. There isn't a truth in US politics that's outside of that, really.
right, there isn't. And I mean, I think of that with debate all the time too. We're creating voters. We're creating people who will at some level either vote on or involved in the process of creating policy. So I mean, I don't see how our images aren't creating, reality at some level. Like, that's why I think we have a responsibility as, debaters and coaches and educators to make sure we're doing something meaningful here. Because yeah, I mean, the images we spread around do very much matter. And this isn't just Baudrillard, right? There's a whole, realm of semiotic philosophers talking about these things. You had Barthes in the early 1900s. A lot of the Frankfurt School dealt with this kind of stuff. This isn't just Baudrillard. I think Baudrillard just writes in the most interesting and fun way. So his kind of name ended up getting associated with this. And then in the Matrix, they have a copy of his book at the
Yeah.
beginning. Neo is like hiding something in a hollowed out Baudrillard book. And it's funny because Baudrillard saw the Matrix and said, "This is a movie that the Matrix would make," or something like that. Which I thought was a pretty funny critique of it. But yeah, it's a really interesting realm of philosophy. Definitely something I think that it taught me a lot. It's one of the things I'm most in debt to debate for introducing me to in terms of like my actual worldview.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so we
Um,
got two more. Do you want to burn through these real quick?
yeah, burn quickly.
Yes. Okay, so we'll go. The next one then is anthropocentrism and tech management. So this is basically the idea that humans attempt to master and control the world around them. This essentially says that the fundamental sin of humanity was moving outside of our ecological niche. So we were hunter-gatherers living in harmony with the world, and then one human got the bright idea to create agriculture and quarantine ourselves off from the natural world, creating this split both in the material world but also in the psyche of humanity that created the foundation for all other violence. Right? It gave us the tools for otherization in our head that we then apply to things around us, but also it gave us faith in our ability to master and command the world and shape it in our image in a way that we are not able to deal with the long-term consequences of, right? The way I like to phrase it is humans are just smart enough to get ourselves into trouble. Um, we can control the world enough to change it, but not enough to change it in a good way, right? Or at least we,
Yeah.
don't understand the externalities. So evidence with this will probably focus on nuclear weapons as a tool of control over the world. as a technology by which we try to master and maintain, risk management. There'll likely be some discussion of the ecological, impacts of nuclear weapons, both in production, test, and use. And yeah, but I think most of it's going to come down to the techno-managerial mindset of nuclear command and control. So some scholars you'll see associated with this. Um, Karen Barad is my favorite one that I tend to come back to. Um, really, really love them. Bruno Latour is a good one. Latour. Donna Haraway is one who talks a lot about cyborgs in a very interesting way, kind of like melding humans and the natural world. Um, yeah.
What are the
So
spellings? I have messed them up.
no, I think you did right on those. Let me see. As far as I know, those are spelled
Okay,
correctly.
we'll
Haraway
edit
is
this.
only Haraway's only one R, but otherwise I think it's correct. Yeah,
Nice.
otherwise. All right. So last one, and this one's actually fairly related. This one is psychoanalysis. So psychoanalysis 1000% should exist on this topic. I think the nuclear proliferation stuff that we read on this topic was really good. This is actually the topic nuclear energy or nuclear power was the topic I started getting into psychoanalysis on. Psychoanalysis looks at how our subconscious emotions over kind of over determine our physical reactions to things. So this is going to explore how things like fear, anxiety, desire, right? How they shape our political behavior, both more than we're willing to admit, but also more than we even potentially understand, right? So deterrence, according to a psychoanalytic theory, would be some kind of fantasy where we're constantly trying to perfect our level of security and constantly trying to, separate ourselves from insecurity uh, in a way that is ultimately impossible, right? Because we will always desire more and more and more, levels of security. Um, a phrase that you'll see often associated with this is master signifier, which is just essentially a symbol of authority that we all kind of cling to or desire towards, right? So in the context of this topic, right, nuclear weapons would be the kind of master signifier that I guess Europe is sort of like fiending for, right? Um, in an attempt to kind of like fill what is referred to in psychoanalysis as the lack, right? This is just this like constitutive, essentially hole in our heart or soul that humans try to fill by creating meaning in the world or doing things in the world, right? And nuclear command and control is just another way of us trying to, fill that empty, unfillable void, right? It plays on our unconscious desires of, anxiety and paranoia, not on any sort of like actual rational calculation of, response on the part of other actors. So the reason I think this is a really obviously interesting avenue is because the topic is literally about subconscious, right? This entire topic is about how we predictably kind of, shape other people's responses or reactions to our actions. And so I think this is just like unquestionably one of the better topics you will ever see for psychoanalysis. There's a lot of good stuff about psychoanalysis and gender and its relationship to like nuclear weapons as like a phallic object. One of our students, Emlyn, like wrote one of her like college entrance exam papers on that, right? Because she learned so much about it in the context of I think it was based on like U.S. Pakistan proliferate or India Pakistan proliferation. That was a really interesting paper. Yeah, there's lots of like I think pretty cool literature around that. Some philosophers you'll see associated with this, Todd McGowan, McGowan is a pretty common one you'll see, especially in the like identity politics literature. Lacan, Jacques Lacan is like your OG one. Zizek is probably the most famous one. Though he be talking about whatever, he doesn't really care. Kristeva is not strictly speaking only a psychoanalysis with a K. Kristeva, Julia Kristeva.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Julia Kristeva.
Um, yeah, but yeah, still interesting, good approach. She writes a lot about like horror, and disability. Uh, really
Wait, that's
interesting.
actually so funny. My girlfriend studied Julia Kristeva in like feminism classes in English at Brown and was really
Yeah,
into it. Actually,
I
I've read them.
bet. I'm really interested in Kristeva. Kristeva was a good I burned like a month and a half on that on the, like a war on drugs topic like 6, 7 years ago about like horror and drugs, and it was fascinating. Yeah. We wrote a bunch of Kristeva stuff against like a disability PES AF, about like confrontation. We also wrote a disability Kristeva AF back when Perry was debating. I mean, that was pre-pandemic. Yeah. Really interesting philosopher though. Yeah. Yeah, so that's basically, I think there's probably more K arguments, but for the sake of this not being 5 hours, I think that's
Yeah.
probably a good place to cut it there.
I have
Um,
one question about psychoanalysis, and then I think we should be
yeah,
done. The question about psychoanalysis is one answer that I was thinking of when you were describing this is like, what if I strategically engage in a psychoanalysis of multiple actors? So, for instance, I'll admit that this is for Europe, this is a fantasy that they're trying to fulfill a lack in, but I can simultaneously hold that this might be rational to do nonetheless because Putin, for example, is also trying to fulfill a lack by doing things that might create the circumstances that render this action rational beyond its use to fulfill the lack in the soul of Europe. Would that like does that make sense? Like
yeah, yeah,
the
yeah. And yeah, you could always see the political arguments that are just like, yes, other actors won't do this. Like, yeah,
right, 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 right.
1000%. Absolutely. That should always be your answer. Yes. No, obviously the K debater should be like, yes, but we don't have an effect on Putin. All we can do is how you and I interact with people in the world. This will make me a more empathetic person. That's not good. But yeah, you 1000% can be like, yes, but realism. Putin's like not giving up. Like the red spread dis hat is low key facts. I don't know. Yeah, I think you're always on the right track, man. I think that the way you're approaching this is good, right? Smart, intuitive arguments are the easiest way to answer this kind of stuff. We don't need new shells to respond to this. We don't need a bunch of cards on policy making good, bad. Yeah, just make smart arguments about like how other people will react to what you're doing and why you don't fix things, and you will get out of a lot of these debates well. Um, yeah. Any other thoughts, questions?
I think that's everything for me. I'll definitely use this for videos later, and then we'll make this a growing living document.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's important, right? And just in terms of like answering this stuff, I don't want to get like too specific into all this. I think that's something we could do where as these things emerge on the topic, we can talk through the best answers on that particular argument. But I think you're on the right track, right? Most of the time, your best answer against all of these arguments is to dispute the link, right? Whether that is a reps link to something you said or a topic link to a side of the topic you're kind of stuck defending, right? The more you can just like bite the bullet and defend those things, the better off you're going to be, right? Because they can spend 5 minutes on frame. Well, I guess it's PF. They're never spending 5 minutes, right? But they can spend 3 minutes on framing. But if they don't win a link argument, the framing is irrelevant, right? They can win all they want that like being racist is a reason to lose, but if they haven't won a reason why you're racist, well, great. That's an easy debate, right?
Yeah,
You
definitely.
should
Uh,
also come generically by defending your policymaking skills in the context of nuclear weapons, right? The more specific your policymaking good cards are, so this is your evidence. We're explaining why technical, specific, detailed analysis of particular policies is the most persuasive way to change commanders or politicians' minds, right? The more specific you have that evidence to nuclear weapons, non-proliferation, or I mean, obviously benefit sharing would be awesome, but I doubt that evidence exists, right? The more likely you will be able to answer these cards on the framing level, or these arguments on the framing level. You should also have your generic theory shells, just so that worst comes to worst, you know that you have something to say that you don't need to burn 4 minutes of prep time dealing with, right? And then from there, you're also going to want to start getting together specific answers against all of these Ks. Look, these Ks don't change. Every topic, there's certainly some Ks that are better or worse on a particular topic, right? But the case list of topics doesn't, if Ks doesn't change, right? If anything, it is easier to prep against this stuff than it is random topical contentions, because I'm still using AfroPest answers I cut in 2017 to this day, right? Um, and so, you can also, and you have the time to do this now, go on the Open Evidence Project, right? Find two cards, even two offensive cards against each of these Ks. Make sure you understand it. It's highlighted down. You understand it enough to give like a 2NR or 2AR or whatever on that particular card, right? And then all of these arguments are going to be really easy to answer. But I really hope that somewhere somebody was inspired by one of these discussions to read something interesting. I think that's the most important part of debate. So, yeah. Do you have
I
any
actually
parting thoughts?
Yeah, I was gonna say this is a good segue. If you've made it to this point in the video, you're probably very interested in this topic and very motivated. I just wanted to say signups are open for the Argument Institute. If you want to join, if you want to get all of our files on all of these Ks and answers to all of these Ks, as well as people to guide you through how to do your own prep on them and how to really investigate the literature. I think the Argument Institute is a cool place to do it. So just wanted
Yeah,
to plug it real quick.
that is fair. Yeah. And we definitely won't have Ks on each one of these things, right?
Sure,
That
yeah,
is, yeah, but there's definitely a couple of these I am very excited to finish. Very, very excited. Yeah, I was sad the Baudrillard article doesn't exist anymore. It looks like that like journal from International Journal of Baudrillard Studies was taken down or something. I haven't been able to find it. I'm sure I'll find something else.
yeah.
Cool. Anything else for today?
No, that's all for me. Thank you everyone for watching.
Yeah, sorry it was so long. What is that, 210? Jesus. All right.
Something crazy, yeah.
Well, I'm gonna stop it before we hit the max. Bye.